Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the New York State Council of Health Systems Pharmacists, I would like to welcome you all to this session of the New York State Council of Health Systems Pharmacists Annual Assembly. We are thrilled to have Lou Diorio as our guest, who will present compounding updates for technicians, how USP and FDA are shaping the conversation. Lou Diorio is a registered pharmacist and is a principal at LDT Health Solutions, Inc., LDT, a medication safety and quality management consulting company with over 70 years of combined pharmacy expertise serving clients internationally. Lou is a graduate of Long Island University's Schwartz College of Pharmacy. Lou is an adjunct professor of pharmacy practice for the college and a pharmacy student preceptor. Lou is a member of the college's alumni executive board. He has extensive experience in IV and extemporaneous compounding, and he lectures, writes, and consults on these topics. Lou lends his expertise to many state boards of pharmacy and is a nationally recognized subject matter expert on compounding, robotics, and automation. Before we start, I'd like to share a few quick points. For those of you who have questions that you would like to direct to the speaker, please add these to the Q&A box during the Q&A period. The CE code for this program will be provided at the end of the program. Attendees must attend the full session to receive credit. And anyone that is on site or nearby for the conference who wishes to join us for the technician meet and greet, it will be tomorrow, Saturday, in the 534 Bistro from 5 to 6 p.m. Lou, the floor is all yours. Lou, I think you're muted.
Oh, there we go. How's that? Am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Tobin. I'm excited to be here with everybody, and I'm looking forward to seeing the folks on site as we try to get back to some sort of semblance of normalcy. But today's subject, we're going to spend some time and talk about how FDA and USP, in addition to some other regulatory bodies, are shaping the conversation around compounding. Let's see. Get the advance to work. There we go. Okay, so I have a couple of disclosures there, and I do have the USP and FDA websites that I'm going to refer to at certain points in the conversation right there. These are our session objectives. We're going to talk about overlapping regulatory authorities. We're going to talk about common citations, and I'm going to try to give everybody 10 tangible takeaways to be able to put in their toolkit and use on Monday, or start using on Monday. So we're going to take a very practical approach to what could be a very dry and complicated subject. So I'm going to dance quickly through the self-assessment questions. So I would like you to think about these as I go through my slide deck. Compliance to USP 800, how does that relate to compliance to USP 797? Are they mutually exclusive, mutually inclusive? FDA guidance documents, what are they, and how do they play in the conversation? The third assessment question is going to relate to the proposed changes, and we'll talk about what that means and how we have to consider the proposed chapters. And then the fourth question is going to have to do with the physical makeup of a compounding space. So those are the assessment questions. I'd like you to sort of keep those in mind as we go through. And before I dive directly into my presentation, I'd like to frame this very particularly. There are current chapters in place in the USP. And the reason that that is important for anyone who's compounding is that the USP is the foundation for the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The USP is, by charter, part of that whole regulatory framework that actually the New York State Board and every state board is built on. So what I'd like everybody to remember is that I am going to, when I speak about a proposed chapter, those changes are not in place. They are draft. I want you to focus on the 4 chapters that are in orange on this slide as official. So I don't want to confuse anybody. And I want to make sure that as I go through the slides that I make that distinction between what is current and what is proposed. But I think it is important for us to look over the fence, as long as you understand you're looking over the fence when we talk about the regulatory framework that we're all living within. Okay, so I'm going to spend a minute talk about the regulatory landscape. Obviously, the profession of pharmacy, the practice of being a pharmacy technician, and especially on a good day, is complex. And then if you're talking about the specific area of pharmacy compounding, it gets even more complex. So within that sort of landscape, the regulatory bodies that overlap and that we have to deal with beyond the state board, especially in your practice settings, also include the State Department of Health, the DEA, OSHA, NIOSH. Your practice setting may be accredited by a voluntary accreditation body like ACHC, the Joint Commission, or one of the other voluntary organizations. So it does get a bit complex. It does get a bit onerous. And what I need you to do, or one of my goals is, I really want to sort of tease that apart and help you understand the overlapping regulatory authorities that could come and visit your compounding setting. And the reason I use the word establishment is that is an FDA term. We are not pharmacies, we are not hospitals to them, we are establishments, we are healthcare establishments. And why that word was chosen, I really couldn't tell you. All I can tell you is that's part of the official vernacular. So with that, let's talk about compliance, okay? The primary tool that we're going to talk about when we talk about how the FDA frames the conversation, the primary tool that the FDA uses is what is referred to as regulatory guidance. And if you want to see the regulatory guidance that I am referring to, because since July of 2014, as a direct result of the New England compounding disaster that occurred at the end of 2012, the FDA has picked up the pace in issuing guidance directly on the subject matter of compounding. Compounding for pharmacies, compounding for physicians' offices, compounding for clinics. It's all sort of the same to the agency. But since 2014, the agency has issued 28 regulatory guidance documents. And the bullets there represent the most, I'm not going to say the most popular, but the most frequently referenced topics. And I am going to speak directly to 2 of those. And just, I want you to remember 3 things. The first is that the issuance of a guidance document is the primary tool that the FDA uses to get their message out there. And the other 2 things I want you to remember are the following regulatory guidances that I'm going to highlight. So what is a regulatory guidance? And it's simply a document that's issued by FDA that represents the current thinking of the agency on a particular subject. And I really, people struggle with this because when the agency issues a guidance, especially a new guidance, they may label it as draft. They may label it as interim guidance. They may even label it, and on occasion, as final guidance. That terminology is kind of meaningless because the agency reserves the right to reissue that guidance, even if it's labeled final, at any time. Additionally, if they have an interim guidance or a draft guidance, they may choose to survey a pharmacy or a compounding establishment with that guidance document. So it's kind of confusing, but you can find all of these on the FDA's compounding webpage, and I will show you as we go through the two that I want to talk about today. We'll kind of frame it, and you'll understand why. This was an article that appeared on the front page of the Wall Street Journal about 2 years ago. And it's got a great title, The Twisted Case of the Deceptive Pretzels. This is actually a very good article to sort of explain how unfair and how confusing it is that the agency uses guidance and not specific law or regulation to police what they do. Now, this article specifically refers to the food industry and how they issue observations, or how they issue inspectionary results to the food industry. The part that I highlighted really talks about the FDA actually working outside of enforceability. It's confusing. They are working outside of their own regulatory process, because there is a process. If the FDA wanted to regulate pharmacy closer, they could propose a rule. It would have to be published in the Federal Register. It would be open for discussion. It would be open for amendment. The FDA is not choosing to use their own regulatory process. They are actually trying to regulate compounding, especially compounding in pharmacies and hospitals and clinics, as well as physician offices, from the shadows. So that is something that I want you to remember as we go through this, because in every practice setting, we really need to understand the rules, understand where the guardrails are, understand what the parameters are. Otherwise, we have no hope to reaching compliance. And this is just my way of telling you that FDA is not helping us there. They're adding more confusion, and I think it is by design, but that remains to be seen. So the first guidance I want to talk about is the in sanitary conditions guidance. All right. And that is not a typo on the slide. The reason that the agency uses the word insanitary instead of the word unsanitary is for a very specific purpose. If you look in Webster's, and I'm a Brooklyn kid, so admittedly, English is a second language for me. So when I looked this up, I realized that use of the word insanitary points directly to a condition of filth or a condition of uncleanliness that can cause up to and including death. So unsanitary is a condition that could be injurious to human health. Insanitary can be injurious up to and including death. So that's why the agency uses it. Now, when we talk about the insanitary conditions guidance, that once you, and I would encourage you to download these two documents, go to the FDA website, they're available as PDFs. This is a very sweeping document, and it's very broad. Drugs, it starts, the 54 key areas start with things like, very understandable things like insects and vermin, rodents. They talk a lot about conditions of uncleanliness, including rust and discolorations in your compounding areas. So you really need to look at those. What makes this document very dangerous is that the drugs that you're compounding don't have to be contaminated for them to cite you for insanitary conditions. The other scary part about this is the insanitary conditions that they cite don't have to be anywhere near the compounding area. They could be in the compounding zone, in the compounding room, they could be adjacent to the compounding room, or by extension, anywhere in the facility. So think about that. If you're working in a large hospital and your pharmacy's on the 5th floor, if they were to identify rodents on the loading dock 5 stories beneath you, they could cite the hospital for an insanitary condition and attempt to shut down your compounding operation. So it's interesting how broad, and it is very commonplace for the agency to use this document. So you need to be familiar with that document and really just focus your efforts on what goes on in your compounding areas, your compounding suites, and your direct compounding spaces. The other document has just been reissued. It was originally released in 2019, and this re-release in October of 2021 contains guidance for both sterile and non-sterile preps. It talks about the reliance on a prescription rather than a medication order. This is a very interesting document because in this document, if the FDA were to attempt to enforce this to the letter, the BUD, the beyond use dating on anything you compound, would be 24 hours and only 24 hours. The agency is trying to build the case that pharmacy cannot or should not compound and should obtain their drugs from pharma or 503B vendors only. So again, that's why I spent so much time at the top talking about guidance not being regulation, guidance being a disclosure document of the thinking of the agency. So I don't want you, once you do download this document and read it, this is not the New York State Board of Pharmacy telling you that your BUDs are limited to 24 hours. This is the thinking of the agency, and this will continue to evolve, but I had to highlight this document for completeness. Okay, I think I skipped ahead here. Okay, so again, in reference to the hospital guidance document, will the FDA police this guidance directly? The answer is no. There is no guidance police inside the FDA. They will discuss this if they come on site. And I can tell you since October of 2012, the FDA has visited about 54 hospitals and hospital-owned compounding establishments. New York State has the distinction of having the first physician's office visited by FDA, quite a few hospitals, and several hospital-owned home care companies. So it is not impossible, but it is not too commonplace. Okay, the FDA is expecting the hospital to police this policy through the hospital's own P&T process, and as I said, the application of this particular compliance document is evolving as we speak. One of the most critical areas that you need to understand about compliance, especially to USP chapters, is that one of the agencies that has sway over the compounding universe is CMS, is the Center for Medicaid and Medicare. And they have no less than 3 of their own documents, their own guidance documents out there. And they have made it really clear that anything less than full compliance to all USP chapters relevant to compounding. So that is 795, non-sterile compounding, 797, sterile compounding, USP 825, which is radio pharmacy compounding, as well as the related USP chapters. Any non-compliance to USP, whether the state board has a specific regulation referring to it or not, will trigger non-compliance to CMS. And if you have non-compliance to CMS, you will violate what's called the conditions of participation And that becomes critical, because if you have violated the conditions of participation with CMS, your hospital or your clinic would not be able to access or build a program. So compliance is key for your facilities to be able to access reimbursement dollars from Medicaid and Medicare. So this document was released by the Joint Commission, and it's called the Hospital Accreditation Checklist, or the HAP. This is an interesting document, because if you look all the way to the right, it is a direct crosswalk between, in this case, it would be the Joint Commission standard and that conditions of participation standard that I'm speaking about. And for those of you that are in facilities that don't use Joint Commission, they may use ACHC or DCA or some other voluntary accreditation body. The rule is still the same. If there's non-compliance to USP, you will be ejected from the program. So this is a kind of an interesting document and a very interesting way to think about compliance, okay? So directly, and these numbers are as of March 18th, LDT, one of the things that we do is that we collect FDA inspectionary data. We have the largest private database of that around the compounding universe, and we use it to run training sessions. We use it to refine and author policy and procedure. We use it to assist facilities that are being visited by the FDA or facilities that have run afoul with FDA. So these numbers are from our database. And I want to translate this into English for you so it'll make a little more sense. On the slide, if you see the term aseptic processing area, that is a clean room or a segregated compounding area. So that's aseptic processing area. When we refer to clothing on this slide, it is not street clothing, and it is not even scrub clothing. This use of the word clothing here, the FDA is using it in the context of gowning and garbing material and also PPE. So that'll make a little more sense to you. But these are the top citations. So the FDA is finding deficiencies in our compounding spaces. They are finding deficiencies on how we gown, glove, and garb. And they are finding that there are deficiencies with our policy procedure, especially in the area of preventing microbial contamination of sterile products. Okay, and then the fifth one is a little scary, that someone who's compounding CSPs would not have a formalized written testing program to even assess the stability and be able to assign a coherent BUD, but that's what the fifth one is all about. This is for your reference. This is an extraction from our database, and it's submitted there for your review later on, but that's where I got the top 5 list. And now I'd like to talk about moving from the FDA's view of the universe. Let's talk about something that's a much more relevant and easier to follow, which is the USP's proposals and the USP rules around compounding. So for those of you that are in broad-based practices, I would ask you to sort of think in terms of what type of compounding do you do? Do you do sterile compounding exclusively, non-sterile compounding? Does your compounding include hazardous drugs? So remember, please, that all chemotherapy, all oncologicals are hazardous drugs, but not all hazardous drugs are oncologicals. And when I use the term hazardous drug, I'm using it in the context of what does NIOSH and OSHA consider a hazardous drug. All right, and that is a session for another day, but you guys can certainly understand what I'm saying. So these are the relevant chapters when we talk about those different areas, right? So a non-sterile hazardous drug, you need to comply with not only 795, but also USP 800. Now, the numbers are assigned in the USP, and they're kind of irrelevant from they're relevant in that any chapter less than 1,000 is enforceable under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. But because you're compliant to USP 800, doesn't mean that you can ignore a number lower than 800. So these are hand in glove. They are kindred spirits, if you will. So you need to, if you're doing hazardous non-sterile compounding, you need to comply with both 795 and 800. In the same way, if you're compounding sterile hazardous drugs, you not only have to comply with USP 797, but 800 as well. So I don't want anybody to get lost in that sort of concept, okay? All right. This is an area, non-sterile compounding in hospital practice, Article 28 clinics. This is an often overlooked area because it's non-sterile and people don't really put it in the right light that it deserves. But I can tell you that the current 795, the current non-sterile chapter, has a sufficient amount of structure. The proposed chapter has a lot of added structure. In fact, they're moving the chapter into sort of a mirror image of 795. They're arranging the chapter in a similar way. They're using common language. They are using common terminology. So the area for those of you that are compounding non-sterile preps is only going to get more complex. So we might as well get on the bus early and try to stay ahead of the training curve here. So, just in brief, there's expanded guidance for the assignment of BUDs. I would ask you all, when you go through these chapters, to really look at the use of water, because that is a huge deficiency in non-sterile compounding. Most pharmacists, my experience is that most pharmacists and most technical people, because the to do non-sterile compounding. And believe it or not, there is an entire chapter in the USP on the selection of water for pharmaceutical purposes. So I encourage you to sort of get that document, take a look at it, and then discuss with the pharmacist who's in charge of this program if your selection of water is appropriate and correct. The other thing about the proposed chapter is they moved around the requirements for some of the dosage forms, and we'll talk about that here, and we'll talk about it when I get to the sterile section. But currently, rectal preps are required to be sterile. In the proposed chapter, they moved them to the non-sterile section. The same with nasal and sinus preps. So once this proposal is finalized, those will become non-sterile, but currently they're on the sterile side. What is not subject to the chapter are instances of administration. So similar to 797, 795, the non-sterile chapter is about compounding and not about administration. Okay, so it's pre-administration activities. All right, and if you're reconstituting, like if you're reconstituting an amoxil or some other antibiotic commercially available suspension, that is not considered non-sterile compounding. That's considered reconstitution. So you really need to pay attention to the definitions inside the chapter and really understand what is compounding and what is not. Unfortunately, New York State is in the category of some of the regulatory descriptions and definitions inside New York State law does not line up perfectly with the USP language. So Down the road, I'm hoping that the Board of Pharmacy gives us some guidance and cleans up some of this language so that we don't have confusion and therefore non-compliance or non-safe conditions created simply because there's a difference in language. Part of the proposed chapter is a formalization of the cleaning, and that is represented on that chart. That's submitted there for your review. So this is a prime example of how they're making 795 look more like 797, and they are increasing the frequencies of regular cleaning. All right, so take a look at that. And with that, I will move over to sterile compounding and talk about the proposal there. This receives much more attention, much more often. So there was a change on medications inside the proposed chapter that are intended to be sterile. And again, I would, once a dose that you compound is attached to a patient or administered directly to a patient, in the case of a bolus injection, 797 ceases to exist. So USP 797 is totally and completely about the current dosage forms like enemas and ophthalmics. So just as the chapter, as this proposal works through the USP process, please be cognizant of checking what is intended to be sterile and what is not. These are the proposed revisions. They're really changing the definition of compounding. There will be a change from the use of the terms low, medium, and high risk compounding into 3 categories, 1, 2, and 3. And I'll explain those in a little more detail in a second. There will be changes in personnel qualifications having to do with media fills and fingertip and thumb testing. There's an expansion. This is actually a sort of a loosening of some regulation. There's an expansion of the role of segregated compounding areas. So for those of you that are compounding in a satellite and not necessarily in a full-blown ISO class clean room, there's actually some language in there that you're going to want to be aware of. All right, and so on. So you can look at that list. 797 will now include standards for specific practices, repackaging of sterile product. Allergy extracts is a separate issue now, and anything that can be described as blood-derived or biological material. So for those of you that are working with analogous blood to make eye drops for things like wet macular degeneration, there is a separate section inside the chapter to help you do that. Again, we often get questions about what constitutes repackaging and what is repacking. Generally, what we consider in hospital practice repacking is probably compounding, because if you are removing an FDA approved product from its original container closure system, even if it's done without further dilution, it is now considered a compounding product. This repackaging is a very narrow lane, and I would ask you to look at that definition inside the chapter. All right, and then there's a specific carve out of anything radiopharmaceutical. So any nuclear medicine is no longer part of this chapter, similarly to how they took out all references or most references to hazardous drug compounding and put it in its own chapter. That would be 800 by itself. This is the biggest change, or one of the big changes in the chapter. It's really the increase of frequency and the sort of getting a very fine point on where we're cleaning, how we're cleaning, and how often we're cleaning. So I'll leave that chart for your review. But in general, the proposed chapters are pushing down on the, increasing, pushing up on the frequency of cleaning, and making it very specific. This is another area where they're increasing the frequency of requirement, and this is in the, excuse me, in the areas of personnel qualification and training. So currently there's two categories, right? If you're doing low or medium risk, most of your activities are annual. And then if you're using raw powder or API and engaging in high risk, you would be doing things every 6 months. This is you can actually think of it in general. And I know it's dangerous when we make sweeping generalizations, but hey, I'm the presenter today and I make the rules. What you can really think of is anything that's in the current chapter that's annual will at least be semi-annual and is probably moving to quarterly. And things that were semi-annual or quarterly are probably moving to either monthly or weekly activity. And that is how you can sort of keep yourself out of trouble. So early on, I mentioned this change in the definition of what constitutes compounding. The biggest switch here is that the USP decided that if you are working totally and completely inside the package insert for a single patient and preparing a single dose, and there are clear instructions inside that package insert to make that dose, you are probably not compounding. You're probably in an immediate use situation. And therefore, if you're not compounding, you would be in an exception to USP 797 and would not have to comply. Okay, so again, if it's immediate use, and immediate use currently is a 1 hour window, if this proposal goes through, that window will expand to 4 hours. So I ask you to go through this detail and then refer to the chapter. And this will be, this is going to impact practice in clinics and in hospitals, especially satellites. And every hospital will probably handle this slightly differently, but the rules to allow you to do that are pretty clear, and they're on that slide. And there's an expanded language inside the chapter. So I would ask you to look at that. So what's all this business about getting rid of low, medium, and high risk? The categories are going to be driven by the physical space. So we're going to talk about the attributes of what a compounding space needs to look like to fall into a particular category. And so this is the lowest category. This is the starting point, right? This is a primary engineering control inside a segregated compounding area or a containment area. And currently by USP rules, you can't do anything hazardous in these spaces. The new proposal will allow you to do hazardous compounding in these spaces as long as the segregated compounding area is under negative pressure. And the biggest change here is that the maximum BUD will be changed from 12 hours to 24 hours. So this is a loosening of requirements for a lot of you, especially folks that are in oncology practices. This may give you a little more latitude, all right? And anything in category 1, because it is such a small window, there's no requirement for USP 71, which is sterility testing. And since you're using finished pharmaceuticals, there's no requirement for USP 85, and that is endotoxin testing, okay? We step up to category 2, and it's very simple. Category 2, the only road for you to get to category 2 is through an anteroom. So if your facility doesn't have a true ISO classed anteroom, either ISO 7 or ISO 8, before the buffer room around your device, you will never get to category 2. And if there is no anteroom in front of your compounding spaces, then the 12-hour, 24-hour are locked in. Be aware of that, okay? And so this is the USP's way to give you a sort of layered, stepwise approach to understanding how your compounding spaces impact your ability to assign a beyond use date to what you're compounding. The other thing I want you to think about is that the ISO classification, the certification of your devices, the certification of your rooms, the measurement of things like air changes per hour, temperature, the relative pressurizations between these spaces, that's all driven by standards that are established by the Controlled Environmental Testing Association. So if you hear reference to an organization called CETA, C-E-T-A, as opposed to PETA, which are the animal people, if you hear references to CETA, that's what they're talking about, all right? And you really need to pay attention to those requirements. Okay. All right, so these are the BUD limits for category 2. And this is really what's holding up the proposals, because this is a severe sort of restriction on what's current. So just to give you a quick frame of reference, currently medium risk CSPs can be kept up to 14 days in the refrigerator without a requirement to sterility test it. So if you look at the middle of this chart here, they're trying to get that down into a 4-day window. And there is language in the chapter that will allow you to keep some things or assign some things a longer BUD, but it would require passing a successful passing of a USP 71 sterility test. So this is where all of the yelling and screaming is going on right now at the USP. I wouldn't get too hung up on this chart because, again, until it's finalized and published, there's no sense of committing it to memory. So don't drive yourself nuts. So with that, let's talk about category 3. So category 3 starts with an ISO class clean room suite, which is a buffer room with an anteroom in front of it. And then you have to add to that compliance to all the requirements inside USP 797 for category 2 CSPs, as well as the following: use of full sterile garb. In category 2, you can wear a frock, but in New York State requires a sterile garb for compounding. So this is not a really big deal for New York State compounders, but outside the country, there's no direct requirement for sterile garb. But if you want to get to category 3, you have to start with sterile garb. You have to start with total body coverage. The use of sporicidal disinfectant agents has to be regular. Increased frequency of environmental monitoring, which is almost daily, and stability determinations driven by laboratory testing that you conduct, or you pay someone to conduct it. You send stuff out to a lab that is not potency over time. It's not commonly referred to as time point studies. You would not be able to use references from the ASHP injectable handbook. You would not be able to use Bing's extended stability or the King's guide. You would have to have USP stability indicating methods. And then obviously you'd have to undergo, or every batch or every grouping of doses you made would have to undergo sterility testing. And if it was applicable, endotoxin testing. For doing all those things, you do get these extended BUDs that could be up to 6 months, but it is going to come at a pretty high cost. So again, I wouldn't commit this chart to memory, but I would, look at it and see what the finals are when the chapter is finally finalized. Okay, so in summary, from my chair, full compliance to the proposed USP compounding chapters are going to require a multi-pronged approach. It's going to require the supervising pharmacist, the IV room supervisors, along with the technicians, working together to put together an approach and a program that's fully compliant to all of the things that we talked about this afternoon. Second is, even though the FDA guidance or FDA guidances in general are non-binding, the probability that a local board of pharmacy is going to take something in that guidance document or something from another standards organization and incorporate that into local regulations should tell you that you need to be up on those particular guidance documents. Considerations to FDA guidance, as well as CETA standards and local BOP requirements, are definitely going to be required so that you have a holistic program that eliminates any sort of gaps. And please, the only answer here is constant vigilance. Because patient safety is our primary objective. So that is, that is really why we're all here, right? All right, and here are what I feel are 10 tangible takeaways, driven by the top 25 FDA list, driven by what we're seeing as far as what the focus is by USP, and also what we're seeing from places like ISMP and some other organizations, and to try to avoid compounding mishaps, right? So the first one is, do you have policies and procedures in place? Written, formalized policy and procedures. Do those policy and procedures include a clear environmental sampling program? All right, do you have proper control over your compounding spaces? Can you document that? Can you prove it? Okay. Do you have policy and procedures and return demonstrated training records for all the equipment that you're using in your compounding space? So for those of you using more sophisticated balances and pH meters, do you really know how to use that? Or is it just simply passed from employee to employee with on-the-job training? That is no bueno, okay? Are you assuring that the PPE and the garb that you have in place complies with all relative guidance? Emergency use authorizations and emergency orders from the governor's office aside, as things get back to more normal conditions, are you sure that all those supplies are appropriate, right? Have you reviewed the cleaners, cleansers, disinfectants, and sporicides in your cleaning process to make sure that those comply with USP and the Board of Pharmacy regulations, right? Have you completed an assessment of risk for all your HD drugs and active pharmaceutical ingredients, all the powders or raw drug that you're compounding with? Okay, whether you compound or not, you need to do this to be compliant with OSHA. There needs to be a list of hazardous drugs in your pharmacy. Have you reviewed the insanitary conditions guidance that we discussed this afternoon, and also the hospital guidance? You can find all those documents with a simple Google search, or you can simply go to fda.gov and look for the compounding page. It's on the left side of the pharmacy homepage. Okay. Do you as an organization review the logs and completed documents to make sure that there are no gaps, that people are filling out these forms appropriate so you can demonstrate that you have control over your compounding program, okay? And have you done the research to back up beyond use dates that you're currently using in your pharmacy? Or is that being done by convention, by verbal history, by past practice? That's not a good basis for a program. You need documents, okay? And have you considered outside resources to help you? And those outside resources run the gamut, right? They could be partnering with a 503B provider. They could be calling in a competent and qualified third-party consultant to help you conduct gap analyses or look at your physical plan. So those are your 10 takeaways for compounding today. And with that, we'll go through the learning assessment questions and then we'll take some questions. So true or false, compliance to USP 800 releases you from the rigors of complying with 797. Anyone? Bueller? That is obvious. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Michelle.
I was going to say people could put their message in the chat box, but it's fine. You can just go through the questions.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
Second question, FDA guidance documents are, okay, the current thinking of the agency. They are legally enforceable. They are never amended once they're issued as final. Or choice D, which is both B and C. Give you a minute. The answer is they're published to share current thinking. They're not legally enforceable. Okay, question number 3. Which of the following is false? The comment period for USP ended March 17th. The current official chapters are in place and should be considered current. You must make changes to your standard operating procedure by March 17th. That was St. Patrick's Day. I apologize because I didn't tell you. I'm sorry, I omitted that from my comments. March 17th was the deadline for submitting comments to the USP committee regarding this proposal. So I'm sorry that this question is kind of unfair, but I think we can riddle it out here as we go through it. You must make changes to your SOP by March 17th, or compliance to USP is considered by CMS for program participation, which is false. Okay, so the answer logically is that since that was just a filing deadline for comment, you obviously don't have to change your SOP by the filing date. Apologize, that was my error, guys. Question 4. Okay, under the proposed 797, which of the following is false? There is a limit to batch size. The ante room is required to maximize BUD. Glove boxes, isolators, or other restricted access barrier devices are no longer usable under any circumstances. And the changes in the frequency of environmental monitoring of your rooms will be needed for under the new chapter. Once you get into the text of 795 and 797, you're going to see that glove boxes, or what we consider isolators, are no longer considered by the FDA or the USP as true isolators because they don't have a decontamination mechanism. And they will, not that they will no longer be usable, that's false, but they will be less useful in extending your BUDs. So that's why the answer to this question is C, like Charlie. Okay. And with that, oh, I lost my questions. I lost my questions slide. All right, we're going to open it up to questions in the chat, and Michelle's going to help me because I have no idea what I'm doing.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, there's a question. It's okay. I usually don't know what I'm doing, but it's fine. So there's a question: what defines supervision by pharmacists relating to observation of text who mix admixtures, and will cameras or IT meet compliance?
Okay, so this is outside of the USP chapters. This is outside of FDA. What you're referring to is the recent, very disturbing way in which the New York State Board is interpreting immediate personal supervision. So currently, states like New York and as well as New Jersey, for those of us that practice on both sides of the river, immediate personal supervision is not or cannot be enhanced currently with a camera or a camera system like Dosage or IVX or Focus or one of those camera systems. They're considering direct supervision to be in the room with the compounder. So not my definition. This is what the OPD is looking for. And I think it is silly and unfair, especially in the context of compounding hazardous drugs, even sterile drugs. Every person that you put into the buffer room I don't look at them as people. I look at them as broad spectrum particle generators. The more people you put into a compounding room, the more risk you're putting into that compounding room. And then when you're talking about hazardous drugs, you're then exposing those other people to the hazardous chemical itself. So unfortunately, right now we're hoping to get better guidance from the OPD and better guidance from the Board of Pharmacy, but that is lacking right now. And I know that I know that the council is trying to reach out to the board to get you a better definition, but currently they want someone in the room, as ridiculous as that sounds. I'm sorry.
I don't see any other, oh, another question popped up.
And
Does
my answer
technician,
was, just so you know, my answer was just backed up by a Board of Pharmacy member who's participating. So the answer right now is no. You can't use a window, you can't use a camera system. You have to be physically in the space.
okay, so the next question, I think this will be the last question because we've gone a little over time, is does technician need to have a special certification to do compounding without a pharmacist?
First of all, under the New York State statute, there is no compounding without a
Without a
pharmacist.
pharmacist, correct.
Yeah, so I think you're typing too quickly, and the question is, that's probably not what you meant. But do they need to be nationally certified? I think the requirements for a technician to register with the New York State Board, I think it's pretty clear in the statute, and I would refer you directly back to the statute.
Okay, thank you for those questions. I just want to make one comment. I'm glad, Lou, that you brought up the New England Compounding Center debacle. For those of you that are on the webinar that don't know about that, you might want to just go look that up. It was a while ago, and I was working in hospital when that all came through, and it was just very sad and frightening. And you can see why all of this legislation came into practice and much more scrutiny on compounding. So that's something that's really worth looking into if you don't know anything about that. I'd like to thank you, Lou, for providing today's session and for answering questions on this topic. And I'd like to thank everyone who attended today's webinar. The CE code for this program is